Hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining us on our very first webinar as part of the Impact Insights webinar series hosted by the Impact Trust. My name is Kelly Notcutt and I'm Head of Strategic Communications at the Impact Trust. Today we have the wonderful Gabrielle Habberton who will be presenting our session today. And just before I introduce her, I would like to first introduce you to the Impact Trust. So the Impact Trust is an independent public benefit organization, and we work to address barriers to sustainability and impact investment through research, advocacy, and education. The Impact Trust has an award-winning team and a global task force of experts with a long track record in social impact investment in both South Africa and beyond. Our team, under the banner of Nexii, also founded the first publicly regulated social stock exchange board, the IX, in partnership with the Stock Exchange of Mauritius. We designed the Impact Insights webinar series to equip investors and entrepreneurs and advisors in the impact investing space with key tools and guidance for success. And we do hope that these webinars are valuable to you. Webinars will be held on a monthly basis. And if you would like to sign up for future notifications of future webinars, go to impacttrust.org.za and add your email address to the subscribe button, as you can see on the screen on the right-hand side. Today's session will be an hour in length and includes a Q&A at the end. All attendees will be on mute throughout the session. If you would like to submit a question during the presentation, you can do so by typing them into the toolbar on the right-hand side of your screen under questions. You can also submit your questions via Twitter by tweeting to the Impact Trust using @ImpactTrust. This webinar will be recorded and will be made available after the live version on the Impact Trust website at www.impacttrust.org.za. So before we begin, I just want to introduce Gabrielle. As a specialist in the field of development practice, Gabrielle gained significant practical experience working with Greater Capital, an organization specializing in social impact investment, consulting, advisory, origination, research, evaluation, and monitoring services through the South African Social Investment Exchange, SASX. As part of the founding team of SASX, Gabrielle was integrally involved in developing the tools and protocols to determine risk, capacity, and return dimensions for high-impact social investment offerings. Gabrielle currently serves as the Managing Partner of Relativ Enterprise Development and the Technical Director of Relativ Impact. She provides ongoing consultation in the field of impact investment to a range of social enterprises focused on delivering high social and environmental returns in complement to their financial objectives. Gabrielle is also an accredited Authorized Impact Representative, or AIR, which is she is authorized to act for social and environmental businesses seeking to list on the Impact Exchange, or IX board, of the Stock Exchange of Mauritius. So, Gabrielle, I'd like to hand over to you.
Thank you, Kelly, and thanks for inviting me to chat today. It's great to be here. So really, jumping into chatting about the impact profile, what that is, it's really about telling the impact story. One of the key things in the ecosystem that Nexii is operating in is that a free market relies on standardized and trusted information to properly dictate where capital flows. And this is a really important element, and really where the impact profile and the role of the authorized impact representative comes in. The reason is that investors tend to ask the same types of questions. So what is the impact story? A little bit more about that. What is the track record? What has been achieved in terms of social or environmental value that has been created or change that has been effected? How do you measure it? And this is where a lot of the trust and standardization comes in as well. So investors want to know, how do I know that your results are trustworthy? And then also, is it sustainable? So can it continue at a certain level or rate? Are there any risks or threats to the success that need to be considered and that I as an investor need to be made aware of? And where the impact profile fits into that is that it's a document prepared by an authorized impact representative, or AIR. And just a little bit on what that is for those of you who might be new to that term. An AIR is an intermediary that has been accredited by Nexii to assist companies listing on the Nexii marketplaces. Kelly mentioned the Stock Exchange of Mauritius. There's also the IC, or the Impact Capital platform. And AIRs provide independent ongoing verification services to ensure the impact and purpose of a listed company is maintained. All businesses or funds seeking to list with Nexii are required to engage an AIR to assist in that process. There are two types of AIRs, the Nominated Impact Advisor or the Impact Verification Agent. The Nominated Impact Advisor, or the NIA, evaluates whether an organization that's seeking to list meets the admission requirements and assists them to getting to that point if they don't already meet those requirements. And then the Impact Verification Agent, or IVA, audits the organization's annual impact report, and this is to ensure that it is appropriate, comprehensive, relevant, and demonstrative of real service delivery and outcomes performance. So essentially, that AIR role is broken up into two parts. So the NIA, who assists you getting to the point of being listed, and then the IVA, who really assists in auditing on an annual basis to make sure that those that impact level is maintained on an ongoing basis. The impact profile is based on the requirements that have been developed for Nexii's impact investment platform. So the IX, which is the public board on the Stock Exchange of Mauritius, exclusively for impact investments, and the Impact Capital, or the IC, which is a private placement platform based in France. Although this impact profile is based on the eligibility criteria for Nexii platforms, these criteria are based on essentially what's emerging as the highest international standards and would likely more than meet the requirements and expectations of other prospective impact investors. So hence the earlier point that investors largely ask the same questions, and so this impact profile can be a very valuable document and essentially process in terms of preparing for approaching investors and stakeholders beyond just the Nexii marketplaces. A little bit about the purpose of the impact profile then. In terms of positioning, identity, it's really a concise and standardized report on the impact nature of the organization. Assurance, it provides third-party assurance from the AIR that the applicant meets the eligibility criteria, which I'll explain shortly. And then accountability, it outlines how each applicant plans to create impact and the measures they are committed to measuring in order to be accountable. So essentially, it forms the basis of what you're going to report against on an annual basis. Then a look at the eligibility criteria. As I mentioned, these are the three core criteria for listing on a Nexii marketplace or platform. You can find out more detail about them. I'm just going to give you a high-level look at them here, but essentially they are important in terms of the impact profile, as these are essentially what the impact profile is seeking to substantiate. So this is kind of your entry level, and then your impact profile is really the outcome of the process of an AIR conducting an assessment on you as a social business to ensure and to demonstrate that you do indeed meet these three eligibility criteria. And So those being primacy of social or environmental purpose that's articulated into a clear theory of change, commitment to impact performance measurement and reporting, and a sustainable business model and a market orientation. A little bit more about those. The first one, primacy of social environmental purpose. Essentially, you need to have specific and clearly stated positive social environmental impact and purpose. So things like your corporate social investment are ancillary activities and services that you would perform. They're not primary to your business being an operation. So when we talk about that, we're really talking about somebody, for example, that is providing affordable housing to lower income markets. And that is essentially their core business. And they do that in a way where they are providing additional social value. So it's not just about providing cheaper accommodation alternatives that might have a high return for the investors and for the business, but it's also about looking at what is the environment that housing is positioned in. What does the broader community look like? What are the kind of social services in the area, etc. And so it's really around that core business being related to your social or environmental impact. And then in terms of being articulated into a theory of change, I'll give you a brief introduction to what that is, for those of you who might not be familiar with it. It's a relatively new term. Yes, so I'll essentially go into that briefly, but why it's relevant is that your theory of change forms the basis for your performance assessment. And then the evidence that you would look at, that an ER would be looking at, is your documented theory of change. Do you have an impact director? Are you accredited or rated or certified in any way in terms of being a social business, in terms of achieving your specific purpose, etc. And then just in terms of introducing what the impact director is, it's also something that's relatively new as a kind of defined concept, but really what it's looking at is having somebody who's on your board of directors, who really is the person who's responsible for kind of steering your organization in terms of the mission and ensuring that that mission is maintained on an ongoing basis. So in the same way that you very often would have a financial director who really is responsible for oversight of the financial side of things, you would want to have somebody who's equally responsible in terms of your impact, if that is something that is a central part of your business. Then looking at performance measurement and monitoring, essentially you want to have systems and evidence of commitment to ongoing monitoring and evaluation of your impact performance using clearly defined indicators of impact for performance assessment and reporting. And here, things that you would want to look at, again, is actually the impact profile, and this would need to be supported by the organization's impact report, and if that is not in place, essentially impact report being an annual report detailing the organization's impact performance, and perhaps you haven't gotten to that stage yet and you're still going to be putting some of those really rigorous measures in, then we would look at an impact forecast, which would really be telling, giving exactly as I said, a forecast of what your intended impact would be. So what are the targets? How are you going to achieve this? Detailing the kind of resources that are involved, and how do you have those resources in place, etc., etc. So essentially a forward-looking picture of what impact is going to be achieved. And then, of course, part and parcel for that is an impact performance measurement and compliance system, and reports that are done on an ongoing basis. in accordance with Nexii impact reporting guidelines. And that obviously kicks in once you listed, and then in turn becomes part of your annual verification in terms of maintaining your listing and demonstrating that you are continuing to achieve the same level of impact and being accountable for the impact that you had stated you would achieve. Then in terms of sustainable business model and market orientation, while the applicant may not need to have reached profitability to be admitted to a Nexii platform, it must demonstrate a market-based approach to achieving its purpose, and therefore be in a position to deploy and provide returns on financial capital to meet the financial return obligations of its investors. This would obviously be dependent on the terms, the specific terms that you have in place with different investors. The business model should reflect socially and environmentally responsible business practices for all stakeholders. And just on that note, what we really mean there is that a lot of social businesses might even be non-profit, that is, they don't distribute profits to shareholders, but may well be able to and do take on debt. So they have loans in terms of being able to achieve their social and environmental purposes, and they are able to repay those loans. So that's essentially what we mean there. And the type of evidence that you would look at there are your audited financial statements, annual report, market reputation, business plan, revenue generation, and so on. Then looking at an overview of the underlying process for completing the impact profile, I just have to put a disclaimer here that this is an overview of our underlying process. Though some processes may vary. For example, some AIs don't necessarily conduct field work. They may have other things in place to accommodate for that. So this is just an overview of our particular process. So in terms of engagement, step one, that's really where we would be taken on and appointed by a particular social business to conduct an assessment towards the impact profile development. And really, often we would be submitting a proposal for the work at this point, etc., establishing the terms, what will be within the scope, etc., etc. Then moving on to step two is where we really begin to, from afar at this point, really gain deeper insight into your organization and begin to look at some of that evidence in terms of meeting those eligibility criteria. And we would typically send a questionnaire to the organization, which would outline a number of questions, which would give us some of the information that we need. We would ask for some supporting documentation so that we can really look at and make sure that things are in place. So essentially our data collection. Then we would conduct field work where we would go and actually spend some time with the organization. We would do interviews, we might do focus groups depending. We would typically like to chat to some of the beneficiaries as well to make sure they actually are there, what has their experience been. So really testing the information that is reported in terms of impact so that we can be sure that it actually is in place and that impact is being achieved, and that the information that the organization is reporting is consistent with what they'd intended, and that they do have the correct measures in place as well. And then that essentially we would come back and do analysis, which would ultimately culminate in developing the impact profile, which would be our report. Then moving into what are the elements of the impact profile. Essentially, as I mentioned, it's a report, and the kind of key sections of that report include general company information. So who is the social business that is applying, things like literally your details in terms of your address, contact details, etc., etc. And equally, who is the heir who's actually performed this assessment and is developing its impact profile. So a little bit of the detail around the area as well. Then it moves into a very high-level look at the eligibility, where the area is asked to provide commentary on how the applicant meets the criteria. And so again, you will perform your assessment with that in mind, really looking to substantiating why this organization may or may not meet those 3 key eligibility criteria, and essentially you providing the explanation around that. Then there's a summary of the overall assessment, which is more narrative summary, and also essentially summarizing the reason for the recommendation as well. The eligibility question is essentially a table which is very specific to those those criteria, and to what extent the organization has met them, whereas the summary provides a bit more narrative room for your explanation. Then we'll look at a risk profile and analysis, so essentially looking at any risks the social business might face in terms of achieving its target impact. And here you might look at things like stakeholder relationships that might be vital for the organization. Could any of those pose a risk? Things like governance, are the correct governance and leadership and management procedures, policy, people, etc. in place? Any potential leadership issues? For example, sometimes you get organizations who just through kind of going through the normal growth and development and organizational development cycles may hit a period where they really are incredibly dependent on their founder, and so you would want to be able to pick up any of those risks, and to what extent the organization might not be aware of those, how they're planning, etc., in terms of mitigating risks. And then another example could be any external factors. Some sectors are far more at risk in terms of the regulatory environment that they're operating in. So if they are completely dependent on license to operate, etc., so a shifting regulatory environment might have a significant impact on them. Things like the weather can be, have huge, completely out of the organization's control, but may have a huge impact, for example, in the case of a building project or something like that. And then you would start to get into the details of the impact of the organization. So details about the theory of change, what is the organization's theory of change, what are the impact data collection systems, reporting standards, and certification. Then just an aside, I promised that I would give a very high-level overview of what a theory of change is. Essentially, it's a visual map or visual representation of your pathway to change. And essentially, it outlines the kind of key stages and where change effectively happens. So looking from your long-term vision, then in terms of achieving that long-term vision, what are the outcomes that need to be in place in order to achieve that? Equally, what are the intermediate outcomes that would need to be in place in order to achieve those outcomes? What are the outputs or direct results that inform your intermediate outcomes? And then, getting into the very specific detail around, so what activities do you actually have to be doing in order to achieve those outputs or results? So what it allows is it's a very simple way to be able to test causal logic, because when it's when activities and outcomes, etc., are represented in this type of way, it becomes quite easy to look at the causality and say, well, if you are attempting to achieve these outcomes, you are conducting the wrong activities, for example, because as you work backwards, you begin to see where flaws are, and that possibly there just are not those connections. And if A plus B does not equal C. And then essentially this theory of change, that the purely visual representation, would be supported by a narrative summary, which would discuss things like any assumptions that you are making, for example, around where your responsibility may begin and end. There might be something that's critical to you achieving your long-term vision, but actually somebody else is taking care of that. So, you know, that's one of the assumptions that you're making, is that, and perhaps assumption sounds a bit loose, but an assumption can very much be that we know that, for example, the government is responsible for delivering this service, so we are not actually doing that, even though it's important for us to achieve our vision. So really talking about your rationale and then getting down to your indicators. So really your measures of success, and how do you know when you have actually achieved your target. For example, how are you going to measure them, how frequently, etc. Who is it going to be measured by? So that's really just a very little aside. There's a lot more detail around this, and actually last year there was a great webinar on this, which was hosted by Nexii. And if you are interested in the theory of change, I would encourage you to watch that webinar. It's really a great resource and a wonderful overview to how theory of change can really be valuable for your organization. Then back to the elements of the impact profile, looking at governance. Essentially, it's trying to determine whether you are compliant with good governance principles, so looking at the policies, procedures, board composition, etc. Technical assistance. This is really a summary of whether the applicant does need any technical assistance in order to meet the criteria. We want to be identifying whether they have the right support. So, for example, here you might have a case where an organization has fantastic anecdotal evidence, and really, you know, you can see the kind of impact story, etc., but they haven't quite managed to really get the kind of rigorous measurement systems in place in terms of you know, regular reporting on consistent indicators, etc., to get more of a quantifiable picture of what's being achieved, where challenges might be, etc. And so an organization might need to apply to have technical assistance in order to build their capacity in that area. So as an heir, you would need to be looking at that, and you would need to be possibly making recommendations on technical assistance service providers that could be helpful and well suited to your client. You may have expertise in that area and be able to provide that technical assistance as well. A lot of authorized representatives would be able to do that, and would have the kind of expertise to perform that function as well. So essentially, providing assurance that if there are things that are not quite in place yet, certainly the organization has a plan in place in terms of how they're going to get that capacity, how they're going to get those things in place, and who's going to be helping them to do that. So you need to consider that. Then looking at the financial and securities detail, eventually financial review of the applicant and information about the security. This component is not necessarily completed by your impact advisor. For example, I'm not a financial specialist, and so I would not complete those sections. I would conduct a financial review. I would be looking specifically at the impact side of things. And then finally, you would have a declaration by your impact advisor to essentially finish off the impact report, and really declaration that they have conducted the requisite diligence, the due diligence on the applicant, and recommend them for the platform. So it's, you know, really declaring around that you really exhausted the due diligence process, everything's complete and accurate to the best of your knowledge, etc., etc. Then here I've put together a list of the type of supporting documentation that we would typically look at in the process of conducting due diligence on a social business towards preparing an impact profile. This in turn should give you a sense of the level of depth that might be applied, and also the types of things you should have in place or at least be working towards if you are considering listing on a Nexii marketplace or even approaching a broader pool of impact investors and grant makers. So the types of things that we would really want to be looking at, we would look at your incorporating documents. In terms of Nexii, it is important here that we actually are asked to confirm that the particular applicant has actually included or recognizes the social environmental purpose component in their documentation. In other words, there's actually some assurance that really is formally incorporated into the DNA of the business, and that down the line, the social environmental impact can't be sacrificed, at least easily, for financial returns, for example. So that's something that we would need to check there and really understand, and be checking for things like where, for example, legal incorporation may affect your social business status. Your incorporating documents would provide that kind of insight. Then just things around who is in your organization, what are the roles, the numbers of people, etc., in terms of delivering on your operational activities. You would want to look at audited financial statements and annual reports, any certifications or regulatory compliance that might be jurisdiction specific. So, for example, we are based in South Africa, and here broad-based Black economic empowerment is something that's important, and you actually get certificates in support of that. And so you would want to understand if there are any specific regional requirements that might be placed in place that the applicant is actually compliant with all of those. Then looking at, we would ask, of course, if you do already have a documented theory of change or logic model, complete with key indicators and underlying assumptions. So ideally, this is something that we would want to actually be signed off or approved by your board of directors, so that it really is something that is guiding your organization. You can have some sense of that. And then we would also look at corporate governance policies and procedures. Some we may just want to know that they're in place. In other instances, we may actually need to have sight of them if there are any particular issues that may have come up. And in terms of corporate governance, here it's really good to align to any particular corporate governance principles that may be applicable to you in your jurisdiction. For example, in South Africa, we have King 3, which is a Code of Good Governance, as our corporate governance benchmark for good leadership and management practice. One thing that I've already mentioned as well, but that's also emerging, is consideration of whether or not you have an impact director. So as I mentioned, someone who's qualified on your board to really lead and champion the impact-related issues of your business. So we really do need to look proactively for those experts in relation to impact and reporting on impact to really guide our organizations. And an example could be that you're a microfinance institution and you may seek a non-executive board member who's an expert in rating and accreditation of institutions in your sector and can really give you advice in terms of trends, reporting, standards, how things are shifting, etc., to really keep you at the top of your game. Then again, looking at what we would really call your impact status, so any relevant certifications, ratings, or accreditations. These vary quite significantly in different areas. And I've just got some logos at the bottom there of some examples. And here it's really looking, as I mentioned, to confirm your impact status. So are you a social business? There might be a situation that where you are based, there's no formal accreditation or recognition of social businesses. That's currently where we are in South Africa. So how that plays out is that you often have social businesses then assuming either a for-profit or a non-profit legal structure that best suits their purposes. In South Africa, for example, a lot of social businesses may be non-profit companies and operate as such that provide some a fair amount actually of confidence in terms of the impact nature of the organization. There are things there around directors, around your mission, etc., in terms of your articles of association that really lend credibility. And then you have things like B Corps in the US, you have the Green Mark, and then additional certifications, ratings, and accreditations, which may be material, might be things that speak to your specific trade or craft, even. So things like certified sustainable seafood, things like fair trade. You see that a lot in coffee, for example, now. So really looking at any of those types of certifications that are relevant for your business, for the sector in which you operate. And then also just in terms of trying to remain aware and at the cutting edge of what's happening in that space, because there are a lot of these kind of coming up all the time. And so as a social business, you really want to be aware of those trends and what's available to best serve you as a business and really provide you with the credibility, the protection, etc. that you need. And then finally, things like environmental social impact reports or your impact forecast that I mentioned earlier as well. And here it's great if you are already using a particular reporting framework that's recognized, that makes things certainly easier. And for example, you may have your impact reports already organized in terms of something like the GRI, which is the Global Reporting Initiative, etc. And that certainly makes those reports easier to work through. And again, working towards standardization is always really helpful. Investors really receive a huge amount of confidence when there's standardization, and they can get a sense of how you measure up in relation to other prospective investments. So as far as you can, look at things like recognized reporting frameworks, certifications, ratings, etc. That's something that certainly is helpful. Although, of course, recognizing that personally, I've had a lot of conversations with social businesses where they say that certain of these things are great, but they don't really speak to the detail that the organization really goes into, and doesn't provide them with sufficient detail for them to really make good decisions on how to improve their services, etc. So, for example, things where you have standardized indicators coming out, very often there are sectors that are not represented there, and so organizations are needing to to find those specific indicators that, while they may provide investor confidence, also really speak to their needs in terms of the type of information that they need to make decisions around their practice, around improving their practice, around their stakeholder engagement, etc., etc. Kelly, that's all I have in terms of the slides for now. I think, do you want to go to questions?
Yes, let's do some questions. Thank you so much, Gabrielle. If you would like to submit a question, please do so by going to the right-hand side of your GoToWebinar panel and going to the questions box. You can also submit your questions via Twitter to Impact Trust. So firstly, Gabrielle, I just wanted to ask, where can I find more information about the IX platform and about listing on the IX as a social business?
So I would say that the best place to start is the Nexii website, which is www.nexii.com, and Nexii being Nexii, as a nexus for impact investing, an unusual spelling. So www.nexii.com, and there essentially you'll find pretty much, I'd say, anything you would need to know initially, and certainly in terms of contacting them and finding more information as well about both listing or information about heirs as well. And so as a social business, there's essentially a directory of heirs as well. So if you are looking for an heir that you want to engage with, there's also information about that, as well as anybody who would like to become an heir as well.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Gabrielle, we have a request to see the contact details on the previous slide, your contact details.
Sure.
Is it possible to display that?
Yes. 1 second. There we go.
Great. So another question I would have for you, Gabrielle, is as a social business, looking at the documents that I need to prepare to be impact profiled, where would you suggest beginning if I have none of those documents prepared? Where would you suggest is a good place to start?
That's quite tough. So I would imagine that in all likelihood you would have some stuff that's really quick and easy for you to get in place. So, for example, I'm sure that if you are a social business, so if you are already an incorporated organization, you would have some level of company documentation available. So I would start there. Something that you would want to consider there is things, as I mentioned, in terms of how your mission or your purpose might or might not be incorporated into those documents. So that's something that you can review with your board. Something like your organizational chart is something that's really easy, and I'm sure most people would have that either readily available or that's something very easy to get into place. Something like audited financial statements. In some areas, for example, in South Africa, not all businesses need to be audited. So it depends on the type of business that you are, and so that is something that you might want to consider. And those are decisions that you really need to make as an organization. For example, is the cost of being audited really worth it at this stage of your development? So for the size and the type of organization that you are, if you're not being audited yet, I'm sure there's a reason. So, if you're kind of working towards, you might want to start considering at what point should you become audited, and at what point is that going to be something that's really relevant and valuable for your organization. Then I would say also things like your corporate governance. policies and procedures, that's something that I think is really helpful to work through with your board in terms of what you do and don't have in place, making decisions around what's available. So as I mentioned, in South Africa, we've got the King 3, which is really helpful in terms of laying out the principles of corporate governance and really what you should and shouldn't have in place. And that's got a comply or explain why component to it for most businesses. And so as a board, you would possibly want to set that. If you don't really have anything related to governance in place, you would want to discuss that with your board and really look at how you can possibly do a review over time. There are a lot of corporate governance specialists. There are people who are accredited company secretaries who are really, and a lot of them work on a consulting basis. They will be able to take you through the process of putting those policies and procedures in place. And just a note on that, often there's a sense that corporate governance is just this extra thing and this extra burden, but really it seems to be a lot of, as it's kind of gaining momentum and becoming more commonplace, and certainly there seems to be kind of recognition that it's really valuable in terms of long-term sustainability and performance of businesses to actually have good corporate governance in place. That's something that should actually strengthen the position of your organization rather than just being something that you have to do. So I would encourage anybody who doesn't have that in place yet to start thinking about that. And then I would say, once you've got those kind of basics in place, is to also really look at something like the theory of change, the logic model. So really trying to identify the heart of what are you trying to achieve and how are you going to get there and how will you know when you are there. Because a lot of organizations go through the process of developing a theory of change and find some activities that they might be doing that they really like doing, but actually aren't really contributing to achieving your purpose. So that's really a great process in terms of kind of a strategic review, really, in terms of being able to sift out possible things that you might be doing, because I think we all, especially in early stages of businesses, we're so busy on doing stuff, it's really hard to get distance and really review strategically what it is that you're doing. So I think that's a really valuable process in terms of refining and ensuring that, well, for one, that you're all working towards the same thing as well. Everybody in the organization, it's great to get input on that, and it's very empowering for staff to be involved in that type of a process as well, and really to gain buy-in at every level in terms of your stakeholders. And then, as I said, being able to really be confident about the things that you're doing and why you're doing them. So you know, they're not just random activities, but they really are towards achieving your goals, and really being able to demonstrate your performance against that. And then from there, I think, you know, again, depending on size, stage of development, etc., you would want to start looking at things like certifications, etc. So I think it's kind of a process of deciding where you are as an organization, because certainly when you get to the level of various types of certifications, etc., you're going to be quite a mature or be sophisticated organization. So if you're really in the early stages, I would say focus on getting to that point of maturity. Think about these things as something that you certainly want to be working towards, but think about them in terms of a time horizon. So there might be something that you certainly want to work towards, but you recognize that at this point you really just don't have the resources, maybe financial, maybe human capacity, in terms of putting those things in place. Is that helpful?
Yes, definitely. Well, thank you so much, Gabrielle. I think we're going to wrap up. If you have any further questions, you're welcome to submit them to info@impacttrust.org.za. That's info@impacttrust.org.za. Any last words, Gabrielle?
Just thank you very much for having me. It's been great, and I hope that it was helpful for everybody listening. Thanks.
I'm sure it was. Thank you so much, Gabrielle. And thank you to all who tuned in today for the webinar. And we hope to see you on a future one. Have a good day. Bye-bye.